I had the privilege last Sunday to be invited to speak at the Marial Chapel here in New Milford. It's not every day that a rabbi is invited to speak at a church, and that is actually a very special chapel. I don't know if anyone's ever been there before. It was built in 1890, so it's got a long history. It's a beautiful building with a really gorgeous wood stove in the middle of it. They did not need the wood stove in the middle of the summer with 90-degree weather, but the people were very friendly there, and I was very well received, and I was very conscious of the fact that if you look at Jewish history, there are only so many windows of opportunity when relations between Jews and Christians would be so good that a rabbi would be invited to speak at a church, and I just felt very blessed to live in this generation where I could have that good fortune. I decided to speak on that occasion. Since I was a rabbi speaking at a church, I thought I would speak on the subject of Christianity and Judaism, parallels and contrasts. Sort of what do Judaism and Christianity have in common, and what distinguishes them as separate and unique religions in and of themselves. Since I did spend some time thinking about this, I thought maybe I could use this occasion as well to review some of my thoughts on the subject. So what are the parallels between Christianity and Judaism? What do they have in common? I came up with about 5 of them. First and foremost, we worship the same God. You know, Jesus worshiped the God of the Jewish people. He considered himself Jewish, and even though Christianity evolved one way and Judaism evolved another way, and in Christianity sometimes Jesus is considered part of God, and in Judaism Jesus is not considered part of God, it's still ultimately the same God that we're worshiping, even if the customs, the practices, the theologies differ to some regard. It's the one and the same God that we worship together. The second thing that Judaism and Christianity share are many of the Holy Scriptures. So sometimes people use the expression Old Testament and to refer to the Hebrew Scriptures, and I try to avoid that term because it makes our Holy Scriptures sound like something passé, something that's no longer important, and they're very important, actually, important enough that they're included in the Christian canon. So the books of our Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those are part of the Christian Scriptures as well as the books that follow after them, Joshua and Judges. What's interesting is the Christian canon orders the Hebrew Scriptures in a different order than we do. In most of the Christian canons, and it varies a little bit, it'll be Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth. And in the Hebrew canon, it's Joshua, Judges, and then Samuel, because we took the book of Ruth, and instead of putting it in a chronological order, as it's often found in Christian Scriptures, we put it with other books that are used for Jewish holidays. The book of Ruth is read on the holiday of, does anyone know? Actually, Shavuot, but it's right next to a book that is used on Purim, Esther. That's right. So we took certain books that are used on certain holidays, and we put them together, so it's like a special section for books that are used for holidays. But all of our Hebrew Scriptures that we have, those are included in the Christian canon, so we share that. In Christianity, they went on to add more books to that, so the Christian canon goes beyond the Hebrew canon, but there are books that we share, and part of our traditions are one and the same, like the story of creation. Also, some of the commandments are the same. So, for instance, in Judaism, we have the 10 Commandments. Moses came down from Sinai with the 10 Commandments, and in Christianity, those same 10 Commandments, I believe, would be every bit as binding for Christians as they are for Jewish people, such laws as thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie. Those 10 Commandments, those are equally binding in Judaism and Christianity. Now, we have more commandments than that. We actually have 613 commandments in Judaism, our commandments go well beyond the Ten Commandments, but at least some of the commandments are shared between Christianity and Judaism. And beyond the commandments, we have certain values. We have the golden rule. In Christianity, it's been come to be known as love your neighbor as yourself. And we have that in the book of Leviticus, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Same thing, love your neighbor as yourself. Whereas Hillel put it, he said, do not do unto others as you would not want them to do unto you. The golden rule can be found not just in Christianity and Judaism, but it can be found in many, if not most, religions throughout the world. And that's something that we share in common. And we have what is sometimes called the Judeo-Christian value system, all of those values that remind us to provide for the widow and the poor and the orphan and the needy. Those values we find in Christianity, we find them in Judaism. So considering all of those parallels, and those aren't the only ones, there's actually more than that, but just to use those as some examples, there are many people who would say that they're essentially the same religion, that Christianity and Judaism are actually the same religion. And I would actually take the counter-argument. I would say that there are two different religions that worship the same God, and there are some features that very distinctly distinguish Judaism from Christianity, and I'll just give a few examples. One is the notion of covenant. Often when I'm working with bar mitzvah students or bat mitzvah students, I ask them what a covenant is, and they always think of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they think it's some box that keeps the Ten Commandments, and if you open it, we're all going to melt or something like that. But that's not a covenant. That's just a box. The covenant, covenants are like a contract. So in Judaism, we have this tradition that there is a covenant that goes all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in that covenant, we have a responsibility, and God has a responsibility. Our responsibility is to keep the traditions of Judaism alive, and that's understood differently by Reformed, Conservative, and Orthodox Jews, but essentially to keep the traditions of the Jewish people alive. And God's responsibility is to protect the Jewish people in every generation. And so far, that seems to be more or less working. We are here today on a Friday night observing Shabbat. We're keeping the Jewish traditions alive, and God has preserved our ancestors and brought us here. So that does seem to be happening. But covenant in Christianity is a little bit different than covenant in Judaism. From a Christian perspective, the covenant in Judaism is no longer binding. So if Jews are supposed to follow all 613 commandments that we find in the Torah, at least the ones that can be practiced in this generation without a temple in Jerusalem, in Christianity, the covenant is different. From a Christian perspective, that original covenant of the Jewish people would not be binding today, and a new covenant would be for Christianity, and that's why Christian people aren't bound to follow the laws of kashrut. They aren't bound to have circumcision, so they have a different covenant in Christianity than we have in Judaism. This is one example. We also have a very different concept of sin. In Christianity, often people talk about the original sin. Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, and they're told not to eat from the tree of life. And sure enough, Eve goes and picks one of those apples, and Adam and Eve eat that, and that's the original sin. That if any of us were in their shoes, we would have done the same thing, and therefore we have this sin in our hearts. And from a Christian perspective, when Jesus was crucified, he relieved humanity of that sin, that humanity was forgiven. Well, sin in Judaism is completely different. Even though that story of Adam and Eve comes from the Hebrew Scriptures, we don't view it as an original sin. We view that as a story about Adam and Eve, but we don't see that as depicting any inherent sin that would be found in people. We don't view people as inherently sinful. We recognize there's a good inclination and perhaps an evil inclination, but we see people as balanced with the choice to choose one direction over the other. What we have instead of the concept of sin, and the reason why you don't hear a lot of rabbis talking about sin is, in Hebrew the word is chet, not hate as in H-A-T-E, but chait, with a chet and a tav, and that is a transgression, but really it's described as missing the mark. So it's as though you were an archer, and you had a bow and an arrow, and you were aiming at a bullseye, and you had the intention of getting the bullseye, but you did not actually hit the bullseye. You missed the mark. Maybe your intentions were good, you meant well, but you didn't do it the right way. That is the concept of sin that we have in Judaism. We don't even say sin, really. It's a transgression. As we tried, maybe we should have tried harder, maybe we should have practiced harder. There are things that we could have done to have made sure that was a bullseye, but it's not the same concept of sin that one finds in Christianity. The most obvious thing that distinguishes Judaism from Christianity is Jesus, right? So in Christianity, Jesus is either perceived as the Son of God or part of God. And in Judaism, it's not that Jewish people don't believe in Jesus. It's that Jewish people don't believe Jesus was the Messiah. I think most Jewish people believe that there was a historical person named Jesus who was raised in a Jewish community, who had disciples that followed him and was perhaps some sort of a teacher with a certain charisma and important lessons for all people, but Jewish people don't associate Jesus with God any more than any other human being would. So it's a very different perspective on Jesus. There's one major difference. And in Christianity, Jesus is understood to be the Messiah. But the word Messiah has a completely different meaning in Judaism than it has in Christianity. In Christianity, Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus dies for the sins of the people, and Jesus will come back at another point. We don't have that concept in Judaism. The word Messiah comes from Moshiach. We have that concept, but in the Jewish traditions, it's a completely different concept. The Messiah in Judaism isn't someone who dies and comes back. It has nothing to do with dying for sins of other people. And the Messiah actually doesn't do a great deal in Judaism. What the Messiah is a herald to announce the dawning of a new age in Judaism. So after we have all done our part to bring about tikkun olam, to bring about healing in the world, after we have done our part, after humanity has succeeded in ridding the world of war and ridding the world of poverty and ridding the world of hunger, then at that point the Messiah comes in Judaism and heralds the dawning of a new age. He comes with a shofar, a ram's horn, and he blasts that to announce that from now on, from here on out, things are going to be different. That concept of Messiah is very different in Christianity than it is in Judaism. And, the last, among other things that distinguishes Christianity from Judaism is the history of anti-Semitism and persecution that the Jewish people have faced. To be sure, there is persecution against Christians. The Romans persecuted Christians. ISIS today targets Christians among Muslims as well. So there is persecution against Christians, but the history of persecution against Judaism is really unparalleled. When you look at our temples being destroyed twice, us being put into exile, when you look at the Inquisition, when you look at the Crusades, which took the lives of thousands of Jews across Europe, when you look at the blood libel, when Jews were accused of killing Christian babies, untruthfully so, there was another, periods of time when Jews were put to death for that. When you look at the Holocaust, which took 1/3 of the Jewish people on the planet, we still have yet to have the population that we had prior to the Holocaust. When you look at that totality of Jewish history and the persecution that we faced, that is something really unparalleled in other religions. It's part of the reason why there's so fewer Jews today as opposed to Christians in the world today. But when we think about Jewish history, there's two ways to view it. You could take the woe is me approach and talk about all the horrible things that have happened to the Jewish people, or you could take the other approach where you look at that covenant and you realize that it rings true to this day. We are alive and well today. We're actually growing and somewhat prosperous and having a positive impact on society. And I think that's something that we can all take heart in. So I talked a little bit about the similarities between Christianity and Judaism, and I talked about the things that distinguish Christianity from Judaism. what do you do with all that information at the end of the day? Well, I think personally, my perspective on it all is that it takes all kinds. In the book of Genesis, we learn that all people are created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that goes for men, women, that goes for people of every ethnic background, every race, every level of intelligence, every level of class within society, every level of education. It goes for, it's non-gender specific. It has nothing to do with someone's sexual orientation or anything that distinguishes people. If we all have the tradition that we come from Adam and Eve, then nobody is better than anyone else. And I think that's an important lesson. There's a very interesting passage in Isaiah, chapter 19, verse 25, where God is talking about Egypt, Assyria, and Israel. And you need to remember, in the ancient Near East, Egypt, Assyria, and Israel were all frequently at war with each other, right? They saw each other as enemies in most periods of time. But God says, Baruch Ami Mitzrayim v'ma'aseh Yedei Ashur v'nachalti Yisrael. Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. And we see God claiming what, at least from the perspective of the ancient Near East, included all peoples. They were not, China was not on their radar screen at the time, nor were Native Americans. But, from the perspective of people in biblical times, that was the entire world. And that was Isaiah saying, God is the God of all people. And so I personally believe that at the end of the day, I think it's a good thing that Christianity is different from Judaism, which is different from Islam, because I think it takes all kinds. I think what we're really meant to do is to work together for the common good, the well-being, and the dignity of all people. Shabbat Shalom.